I've entitled my talk tonight, Contemporary Jew Hatred, a Structural Analysis and Personal Reflection. In the period since my tenure at the State Department ended in January 2025, I've been deeply dismayed by the ferocious rise in anti-Semitism. There have been murders in Boulder, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Manchester, England, Bondi Beach, Australia, and Montreal, Canada. A man drove a car into a synagogue preschool in Detroit, Michigan, in an attempt to massacre children. The tragedy was prevented thanks to the bravery of the security guard and because the hallway doors were too narrow for the car to reach the classrooms. Synagogues in 5 different continents have been subjected to arson attempts. In London, ambulances belonging to Hatzalah, the Jewish first responders organization, Hatzalah as they call it, were set aflame. Jews have been stabbed on heavily trafficked streets. Young girls have been harassed on buses in London and subways in New York, while other passengers sat silently by. And just in the past few days, a man was beaten up and harassed for an extended period of time in Barcelona while nobody did anything. When such incidents occur, particularly if they involve fatalities or physical harm, they are universally condemned. Everyone, or almost everyone, rushes to decry them and personally declare that they are entirely unacceptable. But since October 7th, these condemnations increasingly come with a caveat, a but. Sometimes it is explicit, quote, but we cannot forget what Israel is doing in Gaza, close quote. This is code speak for, this act may be wrong, but we must understand where it's coming from. Here's the unspoken part. We must understand, and having understood, we must empathize. And with our empathy comes recognition that forgiveness is unnecessary because the act was justified. But not all the caveats are so explicit. A slightly oblique but more pernicious form of rationalization was evident in the United States on National Public Radio, NPR's treatment of the Detroit synagogue ramming. Rather than profile the victims, interview the traumatized teachers whose quick actions saved many little lives, or explain how the security guards prevented the tragedy, NPR chose to profile the murderer's Lebanese hometown and his family. The report detailed, quote, the grief and fear, close quote, that Israel's attack caused in this village. Among the casualties NPR reported were several of the drivers that would-be murderers' relatives. They turned out to be Hezbollah operatives. After being inundated with severe criticism about this skewed coverage, NPR's public editor acknowledged that though the station, quote, ran multiple stories on the attack, voices from Temple Israel were absent. She said, I couldn't find any stories that quoted rabbis, congregation members, or families of the children who had to flee the building. But then, apparently unable to contain herself, the editor added the inevitable caveat. She said, NPR's intention was not to condone or rationalize these attacks, but to humanize the driver's family. What we are witnessing here is far more than just the surge in the number and intensity of anti-Semitic attacks. What lays behind it is something new, something different. The paradigms on which we have relied to understand and address Jew hatred no longer apply to the current situation. At my confirmation hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at the level of ambassador, you have to be Senate confirmed, in response to a question of whether I thought anti-Semitism was worse on the right or the left, I described anti-Semitism as situated on a spectrum from right to left, and I said all forms were bad. Had I been before this audience, I might have said that question is like asking Shalom Aleichem, would he rather have dysentery in Odessa or cholera in Kiev? Neither, thank you. Shortly after entering office, I discarded that construct. I did so when I saw how extremists on the right and the left simultaneously shared an intense Jew hatred and anti-Zionism. A spectrum suggests that their views are diametrically opposed to one another. While that may be true on most issues, their views on feminism, capitalism, sexual identity, when it comes to anti-Semitism, their views coincide. I began to rely on the image of a horseshoe, where the two extremes, despite being at opposite ends and opposite poles, are bound together by this shared hatred. In the wake of October 7th, I came to recognize that the horseshoe structure or paradigm is also inadequate for understanding the reality of what we were seeing. Inadequate because, like the spectrum, it fails to include the third and increasingly most dominant force in the spread of Jew hatred, Islamist jihadism. On campus classrooms and the Quad, at protest marches in Sydney and in London, and a myriad of other settings, Islamist extremism has been a galvanizing force in the spread of overt and often deadly Jew hatred. It poses an existential threat to Jewish physical and communal survival. I do not mean to suggest that these three sources of anti-Semitism, left, right, and Islamist jihadists, are new. Anti-Semitism from all of them have a long and venerable history. What is new is the way they have made common cause with one another. This is particularly evident in what has become known as the Red-Green Alliance. Their disagreements the disagreements in the Red-Green Alliance are vast. Think feminism, religious pluralism, capitalism, sexual identity, and the fact that Marxists and progressives support a secular state and Islamists seek a caliphate. And now increasingly we see those on the populist, nationalist right adopting these views. Their mantras now include severe opposition to Israel, holding Jews, particularly in America, American Jews who compel America to support Israel, responsible for an array of troubles facing the United States, and contempt for Israel and its supporters. Think Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Megyn Kelly, and so many others. More than just a common cause, the far right, far left, and Islamists have built a coalition in which this cross-ideological anti-Semitism becomes the unifier, the glue that holds these ideological opposites together. However, if one goes behind their Jew-Israel hatred, one finds they do share certain views. We always thought that all their views are in opposition except for their Jew hatred, but it's really not true. For example, the far right, which is often seen as possessed of a deep-seated antipathy to Islam, shares with Islamists an antipathy to Enlightenment and Western liberalism. All three of them share an anti-imperialism, believing that the imperialism under which they live and are governed is hostile to them. Think DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and MAGA. Both think that the reigning authority is hostile to them. Of course, what they would want to replace this imperialism with differs widely. I was reminded recently of the demonstrations in 1979 when the Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran. And those supporting the demonstrations included absolute Islamists and liberals in Iran who wanted a new and free Iran. And they came together, the Ayatollah, hoping the Ayatollah would bring that, and one side was deeply disappointed. But it's not only this strange but potent coalition that is new. There's something else that is new, a new delivery system. I refer not just to social media or to AI, which Katarina just spoke about, but to the use of social media by what my government describes as foreign malign influences, FMI. These FMIs work through proxies, social media bots, and direct contacts as they instigate, magnify, and promote Jew hatred and anti-Zionism. They spread anti-Semitic disinformation, engaging in what some do it out of ideological desires, such as those associated with Iran. Some do it out of what I call utilitarian motives, such as the PRC, the People's Republic of China, not motivated by ideology as Iran, but motivated by using it, to use a very impressive academic term, as a kochlöffel, a cooking spoon to stir up the pot and make Western societies doubt themselves. Sometimes these FMIs engage in old-fashioned physical acts of anti-Semitism, but use social media to alert the world to them. During my final weeks in office, Rabbi Tzvi Kogan, a member of the Chabad team in Abu Dhabi, was abducted and murdered by 3 Uzbek nationals. According to the Mossad, the Uzbekis were hired by Iran to carry out the murder. In the months after I left office, 5 Jewish sites in Paris were desecrated with green paint during Shavuot. According to French authorities, Serbian nationals hired by a Russian agency did this. In August 2025, the Australian government charged the IRGC with responsibility for the firebombing of a Melbourne synagogue and a kosher restaurant in Sydney. These attacks were intended, according to Australian authorities, to tear at Australia's social fabric and, of course, to frighten Jews. Subsequent attacks in the UK, including stabbings, were linked to Iranian-backed entities. The Canadian police have warned that Iran is hiring proxies to carry out attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions. The fight against FMIs, foreign malign influencers, must be conducted by cooperative government action. No country can do this alone. There must be a concerted effort amongst countries to find and identify FMI threats. Once identified, the information cannot be held in secret, as it often is, but it must be shared with other countries. There is a duty to warn, to alert. There's also something else going on, and I call that the toxification of Jewish life. I turn now to the impact of this escalation of acts of Jewish hatred and anti-Zionism, what the impact they have on Jewish life. There was a time when an American visiting European or South American synagogues or Jewish institutions would know to identify them by the security guards outside. Now that's the case in the United States. And in Europe, the strictures have become more severe. Visitors are told that if they wish to attend services, they must register a few days in advance so the synagogue can identify who they are. Early in 2025, I noticed that invitations to a Jewish event in the United States often failed to note at what venue it would be held. You'd be invited to a communal event, date, time, the program, no address. Only after registering and passing a security clearance would you be informed of the locale. After the murders of the 2 attendees in winter 2025 at an event in Washington's Capitol Museum, where registration was required, but somehow the murderer managed to register, this has become the norm for most communal Jewish events, certainly in the United States. Some events, some incidents leave no scar. You get an address without an invitation without an address. It doesn't leave a scar on you, as might a attempt to murder little children at a temple preschool. But their emotional impact can be high. In the 21st century, there are generations of Jews who have come of age with the reality that there is security at every Jewish gathering, whether private or communal. People now have security at bar mitzvah gatherings or weddings. There's somebody outside checking. These younger Jews know nothing, know no difference, that this is the norm for them, and they justifiably assume it's a universal norm. Learning that it's not the case cannot but have an impact. Consider Adam Boxer's 9-year-old daughter. Boxer is a teacher at a London secondary school, TTA, Totteridge Academy. One day in the spring of 2026, a few weeks ago, it was his turn to offer the thought of the day, the school's ritual for inaugurating the school day. Each day another teacher offers it. He chose to describe what it's like to do duty as a CST security volunteer at his synagogue or his children's Jewish school, JCAS. While he explained to the students he donned the Kevlar-reinforced stab jacket he wears when on duty, and explained that his job was not to be a superhero and fight the would-be killers, he was trained to impede the attackers so that more families or children might reach safety during an assault. Slowing down the perpetrators, he explained, by just 10 seconds can save multiple lives. I watched his presentation online, and I was impressed with his low-keyed, matter-of-fact, even demeanor. But there was one portion of his presentation that sits with me weeks after I first watched it. After explaining his responsibilities to the students in his school, he described how that morning, when he drove his 9-year-old daughter to her Jewish school on his way to TTA, she asked her father why he had his stab jacket in the car. When he explained that he was going to demonstrate for his students what he did as a security volunteer at her Jewish school, his perplexed little girl asked in an astonished voice, "What? They don't have security at their school?" He admitted that he was stumped about how to respond. How, he wondered, could he tell his little girl that TTA did not have security, quote, because we don't need it? How could he tell her that while there are people sitting in their bedrooms plotting how to kill Jews, including her, there were no people planning to do that to harm the children of TTA? Having to be protected by people in Kevlar jackets in order to go to school or pray is neither normal nor healthy, but is the reality for his daughter and for Jews worldwide, with the exception of Israel. We are witnessing a concerted and not entirely uncoordinated effort to make Jewish life more difficult and something more prudent to avoid. I know people who faithfully go to services on Friday night or Shabbat morning, or both, but have decided that maybe it's not so safe and they'll watch online. These, of course, are non-Orthodox synagogues. And they stay through the end, they enjoy it, they love it, but they're not part of a community. They're at home in their living room, their kitchen, whatever, watching alone. As part of this toxification, there's an attempt to take things that are normal in Jewish life. The word Zionism, Hillel, AIPAC, whether you agree or disagree with their policies, but to make them toxic, to make them so that all you have to do is say them and the person pulls back. The mayor of the city with the second largest Jewish population in the world recently declared supporters of Israel to be monsters. The effect spreads far and wide. There's also been a willful ignoring of one source of the threat, one I mentioned earlier. For a long time, possibly since 9/11, talking about the threat posed by Islamist ideology and Islamist jihadist ideology to Western civilization and democracy was the third rail of liberal political discourse. To do so would be to be branded an Islamophobe. Maybe it began when George W. Bush described Islam as a religion of peace, and that shut down the debate about Islamicism. Over my time in office, I observed, particularly when in conversation with European officials, that they were reluctant to directly identify this problem. After October 7th, some were more willing to speak of, quote-unquote, recent arrivals causing problems. They rarely elaborated on who these recent arrivals might be, but they clearly assumed it was unnecessary to do so. Today, with the preponderance of attacks perpetrated by Islamists, not just Islamists, but many Islamists, that reluctance has dissipated somewhat. Some of them are even willing to acknowledge that it's not just recent arrivals, but homegrown radicals as well. There's a double tragedy here. Not only do these Islamist radicals target Jews and Jewish institutions, but they also target their fellow Muslims, including minority Muslim sects, Muslim liberals, and Muslim women and girls who refuse to comply with their Islamist religious precepts. These too are in their crosshairs. Counterterrorism experts have lamented the fact that by failing to acknowledge the existence of this stress and by a threat, and by evading directly addressing it, we are, to use a contemporary term, throwing moderate Muslims under the bus. Let me speak now more personally. I am overwhelmed by a profound pessimism about the present state of Jew hatred. This is not a familiar location for me. If Jewish life runs on a spectrum from oi to joy, I have long situated myself at the joy axis, even while studying the Shoah, Holocaust denial, fighting deniers in court, and so forth. I once attended a convivial dinner party of university professors. Towards the end of the evening, one of the alcohol-infused guests, a non-Jew and a colleague, but hardly a friend, turned to me and said, "Be honest, Deborah, if you had your druthers, you wouldn't have chosen to be born a Jew, right?" It's as if he was asking someone who was born with an infirmity, a category into which he clearly seemed to place being Jewish, whether they would have been chosen to be born that way. His tone and demeanor left little doubt that he posed the question more in cynical jest than in serious interest. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Conversations halted. People shifted a bit in their chairs. Anxious to take everyone out of their misery, while simultaneously inflicting a bit of pain on my interlocutor, I answered with feigned, lighthearted laughter, "Oh no, you got it all wrong. I feel, dare I use a word academics abhor, blessed to be a bearer of a terrific tradition and a member of this tribe. I rejoice in its teaching and even its history, even though some of that history has been horrific." Then, to make it clear that I found his query so ludicrous as to be laughable, I added with a trace of seeming bewilderment, "You certainly don't imagine I think otherwise. Given everything Jews and Jewish tradition have given to the world, that could not be." He looked a tad surprised at my response and a bit unsure of how to proceed. I have to admit I was experiencing just a bit of schadenfreude at his discomfort. Even before the evening, I never really liked him, and this reminded me why. I plunged ahead. I was in it. I said, "A colleague once described me as an unambiguous Jew. I took that as a great compliment. I would not want to be anything else. You can't think I would choose otherwise, right?" My interlocutor smiled wanly, said nothing, and returned to nursing his after-dinner drink. Someone asked for more dessert, and the evening moved on. Shortly thereafter, we all headed for the exit. Never have I camouflaged my Jewish identity. I have worn it on my sleeve, and for the past decade, around my neck. About 10 years ago, as acts of anti-Semitism became more blatant and frequent, I asked a friend who is a jewelry designer to craft a Jewish star for me. I put it on and have never taken it off until a few weeks ago. I have a 14-year-old neighbor with whom I have been friends since the day she was born. We bonded over books. From her infancy, every night I read to her, just as I had done with her brother before her. When she was about 5, we decided to try Harry Potter. Over the next several years, we read every word of every book. By the 6th book, she was reading to me. After each book, we watched the movie. Cardinal rule, book first, movie second. When we finished our multi-year project, I promised to take her to the London studios, a fantastic and highly recommended excursion. We were scheduled to depart early in June 2026, right before writing this talk. Unlike my frequent trips to London, which David has referenced, this one was to be filled with tourist attractions. In addition to the Harry Potter studios, we'd be visiting the London Eye, Globe Theatre, Buckingham Palace, the Houses of Parliament Theatre, and many more sites. All our areas crowded with strangers. Before we left, I warned my young friend that London had been beset by a rash of phone snatchings. We had to be on the alert and could not nonchalantly check our phones as we ambled down the high street. I showed her how to frustrate pickpockets who frequent tourist areas. I warned her about this thing, but kept silent about something else: the degree to which overt acts of anti-Semitism have plagued London, including the areas we would be visiting. I said nothing about any of this. Now, it's not as if she doesn't know about anti-Semitism. She does. She's my neighbor. She visited me in Washington. She's a student at a Jewish school, and she's the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. But I did not wish to cloud our trip with a sense of fear. Nor did I tell her that right before our departure, I did something that I hadn't done in nearly a decade. I took off my Jewish star. When I took it off, I'd never taken it off in 10 years. The locket broke, so I'm not wearing it today because it's at the jeweler's. I have worn it in Riyadh, Jeddah, Medina, Abu Dhabi, Berlin, Santiago, Casablanca, Sao Paulo, Brussels, Paris and its suburbs, dangerous areas for Jews, amongst other places. I wore it in Amsterdam, but a few days after the 2024 soccer riots. It figures prominently in my State Department photo. Go look. I wore it both when I was surrounded by security and when I wandered the streets and markets alone. Today, at the theater and at Costco, museums and the beach, academic conferences and the recycling center, it is around my neck. But now I was traveling with a child who was not my own during a time of profound rise in anti-Semitic hostility and a place where it was rampant. As I removed it, I thought about a friend who recently picked up her 11-year-old grandson from his Chicago Jewish day school. She owed him his afikoman presents, so she took him to Target, one of those American big box stores that the fans who have come to Haifa think are entire cities. As they entered the store, he seamlessly removed his kippah from his head and slipped it in his pocket. Seeing his grandmother's puzzled look, he explained, "Ima wants me to do that." This is a child who's being raised in a vibrant Jewish home filled with a deep-seated embrace of its traditions. In it, there's far more Jewish joy than oi. Yet he had absorbed the message that sometimes it's safer not to telegraph one's identity. Being Jewish is something that at certain moments and in certain places is better hidden, not celebrated. Given recent events, who could argue with that? I, who had just removed my only outward sign of my heritage, certainly could not. There are far too many children like my friend's grandson in Chicago or Adam Boxer's daughter in London. But this pessimism notwithstanding, I do not think of myself or my fellow Jews as victims. We have faced far worse than we face now. I was given a graphic reminder of that in the year 2000, shortly before the beginning of my trial. Though my legal case was strong and my lawyers confident, I shared David's concerns. The implications of a win for David Irving, whom I considered a rabid anti-Semite and a racist, were frightening. Even if he won through some legal fluke, Irving would undoubtedly trumpet the fact that the court ruled in his favor by finding that I had defamed him when I called him a Holocaust denier. He would have posited that ipso facto, his version of the Holocaust was genuine. My concerns intensified as the trial grew near. A few days before it was scheduled to begin, I was already in London when my good friend, the late Grace Cohen Grossman, called me from the States. Grace was one of the world's premier curators of Jewish art. She declared, "Deborah, you must go to the British Museum." I assured her with my trial looming, the last place I was planning to visit was a museum. She kept insisting, "It's important." Finally, I told her, "I'm not going. But if I were to go, what would you want me to see?" Her response was immediate: the Lachish reliefs. And I understood. The Lachish reliefs were commissioned by the Assyrian king Sanherib in the 7th century to celebrate his exceptionally brutal attack on the kingdom of Judah and his victorious capture of its second most significant city, Lachish. They decorated his palace at Nineveh, which today is in northern Iraq. Some of you may know Nineveh as the city to which Jonah was sent when he had that unfortunate encounter with the whale. The reliefs depict the vanquished Judean leaders coming to pay obeisance before the king. Some are shown bowing low, while others are being executed or flayed alive. In the reliefs, Jewish refugees, men, women, and children, stream out of the city gates with their livestock and possessions as they begin their forced march into lifelong exile, as had the 10 lost tribes in the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel. Sancherib fully anticipated that his next conquest, read the Tanakh, you'll see it there, and his next conquest would be Jerusalem, the only city larger than Lachish. And had he conquered it, with that, the kingdom of Judah would have come to an end, and Jewish history might well have ended there. But he did not. Before Grace hung up, she told me what I already understood. Sancherib thought he had vanquished us. He failed. Today, anyone who wants to learn about the ancient Assyrians must go to a museum. But us, we're still here and we're vibrant. In recent days, I've thought back on that conversation. While the contemporary situation has deteriorated, Jews have endured far worse, whether in Judea in the 7th century BCE, Europe in the 20th, and too many other times and places in between. Jews have recovered from brutal assaults and almost total annihilation. One could argue that the difficult history that Jews have faced have prepared them to deal with catastrophe. Shimon Ravidovich, some of you may remember his article, Jews, the Ever-Dying People. Anti-Semitism may shock them, but it rarely surprises them. Though having been repeatedly victimized, we are not victims. We remain strong in our identity as Jews, not because of the hostilities, but afal pi, despite the hostilities. Grace was right. Who today speaks of Sancherib? No one except students of ancient history and visitors who make their way to the British Museum. In the face of overwhelming odds, Jews have survived. More than survived, they have thrived. I have complete faith in the future of the Jewish people. However, I do not know if democracy and its institutions are possessed of the same resilience. History has not tested modern democracy repeatedly the way it has tested Jews. Less than 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States to study the nature of this nascent nation. In fact, he came to study the American prison system, but found the emerging democratic society far more intriguing. His reports were marked with awe. He marveled how an entire city embraced and built democracy. But when Tocqueville visited the United States, democracy was ascendant. If his progeny retraced his steps today, they would see something quite different. They would see a democracy that seems fragile and under threat. Institutions we once thought inviolate are proving not to be so, and I know I speak of the United States, but I think it applies to other democracies as well. They are under assault from multiple sources. One of the lessons I took away from my time in office was that Jew hatred, whether ideological or utilitarian, is being used not just to wreak havoc with Jewish life, but to erode that democracy and create doubts about its long-term viability. Erwin spoke about that earlier. It is the oldest and longest hatred, and as such, it is a perfect tool for those who hate democracy, the rule of law, and the international stability on which they so depend. The onus is on society at large. If it fails to comprehend that it too is in the crosshairs, and that it must commit itself to responding forcefully and unequivocally, then the pessimism of which I spoke a few moments ago will be more than justified. For the sake of democracy's survival, those who treasure it cannot afford to look away from the scourge of anti-Semitism. To the general world, I say, this is not only about Jews. It never has been. It is about Western civilization writ large. It is about the future society we wish to build, and for those of us at the other end of the age spectrum, wish to leave to future generations. No one who values democracy, rule of law, international stability, and security can afford to look away. Far too much is at stake. And to the Jewish world, I say, with apologies to Herr Schlick, wir seien da, we are here. Thank you very much. Thank you.